The drive up the mountain had been long and winding, the road gradually narrowing until it felt as if it were carved solely for this one path to the isolated cabin. When I arrived, I took a moment to breathe in the crisp, cold air, feeling the quiet solitude settle over me. The Airbnb listing had promised seclusion, and that's exactly what I'd found. A small rustic cabin surrounded by dense forest, the snow blanketing everything in a pure, undisturbed white. Inside, the cabin was cozy, with a wood stove crackling to life, casting a warm glow across the room. I relished the silence that filled the space. It was a rare escape from the noise of daily life, an opportunity to unwind in complete solitude. As evening approached, I watched the sky deepen into shades of blue and gray, the snow reflecting the fading light. There was something serene, almost meditative about the cabin, and I felt the tension from the city life melt away. That first night, I fell asleep easily, cocooned in blankets and lulled by the gentle silence. The mountains seemed to cradle the cabin in a kind of protective stillness, and as I drifted off, I felt the contentment of true peace. Little did I know that the tranquility would be short-lived, and the very silence I found so comforting would soon become something else entirely. Sometime in the night, I awoke to a sound, a faint, almost imperceptible noise drifting through the walls of the cabin. In my half-asleep state, I lay still, listening. It was nothing more than a subtle creak, like footsteps on old wood, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. My rational mind told me it was the cabin settling in the cold, the structure adjusting to the biting winter air, but a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that the sound was deliberate. I lay there, listening as the sound faded, convincing myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me in the dark. When nothing further happened, I closed my eyes, trying to relax, but the silence now felt different, heavier, as if the walls were holding their breath. Eventually, exhaustion overtook my unease, and I slipped back into sleep, the sound lingering in the edges of my mind. In the morning light, the fear seemed distant, irrational. The cabin was warm and bright, the previous night's disturbances seeming almost laughable in the daylight. I brushed off my apprehension, chalking it up to being alone in an unfamiliar place, my mind making something out of nothing. Stepping outside in the early morning, I was greeted by a scene so peaceful it felt surreal. The snow stretched out in an unbroken expanse, sparkling under the pale sunlight. But as I looked closer, I noticed something that sent a chill racing through me. A line of fresh footprints leading from the edge of the forest to the cabin. They were spaced out, unmistakably human, and they trailed up to the side of the house, stopping abruptly near one of the windows. My first thought was that someone else must be staying nearby, maybe a hiker or someone from another cabin. But as I followed the tracks with my eyes, they stopped just as suddenly as they had begun, with no trace of them retreating back into the forest. It was as if whoever had left them had simply vanished. The silence of the morning felt oppressive, the weight of those footprints pressing down on me as I tried to make sense of them. I walked around the cabin, scanning for any other signs of disturbance, but everything else was pristine, undisturbed. A sense of unease settled into my mind, but I forced myself to ignore it, convincing myself that it was probably just an odd trick of the snow, or maybe my imagination running wild. The following night, I went to bed with the day's unsettling discovery still fresh in my mind, trying to push away the lingering unease. Hours into the night, however, I was jolted awake again, this time by a louder noise, a series of faint yet deliberate footsteps outside, as though someone were pacing around the cabin. I held my breath, listening. The sound was unmistakable, a slow, measured rhythm that echoed through the walls, amplified by the silence of the mountain. Heart pounding, I crept to the window, careful not to make a sound as I peeked outside. Under the faint glow of the moonlight, I saw it, a tall, shadowy figure moving away from the cabin, disappearing into the dense line of trees with a grace that felt almost unnatural. For a moment, I was frozen, unable to tear my eyes away from where the figure had vanished. My rational mind searched for explanations, grasping at any shred of reason that could explain why someone would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, pacing around my cabin in the dead of night. But the sight of that figure retreating into the forest was burned into my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone here. The following morning, I stepped outside, half expecting to see more footprints or some other trace of the figure I'd seen in the night. But the snow lay undisturbed, pristine and untouched, as though nothing had ever been there. The sight should have been reassuring, but instead, it only amplified the lingering unease that gnawed at me. I scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of movement, but the forest remained eerily silent, shrouded in a heavy stillness that felt almost intentional. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that maybe I'd imagined the whole thing in a half-awake state, that perhaps the isolation and silence were beginning to play tricks on me. But I couldn't ignore the tension that coiled in my chest every time I looked at the forest. Every shadow, every distant sound seemed to carry a hidden threat, as though the trees themselves were watching, waiting. As I went about the day, I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, my senses heightened, on edge. The cabin that had once felt peaceful now felt like a trap, surrounded by the indifferent vastness of the mountain, miles away from any other human presence. I told myself it was all in my head, that I was overreacting, but the unease remained, lingering like a shadow that refused to be shaken. By the time night fell, my nerves were frayed, worn thin by the constant feeling of being watched. I tried to sleep, but every creak of the cabin seemed amplified, echoing in the silence, each sound a reminder that I was alone, vulnerable. Just as I started to drift off, a loud bang jolted me awake, a sound so sharp and deliberate that it sent a surge of adrenaline coursing through me. The noise had come from the back door, a hard, resounding knock that felt intentional. I lay there, frozen, listening as footsteps crunched softly in the snow outside. Whoever, or whatever was out there wasn't moving quickly, their pace slow and deliberate, as though savoring each step. My mind raced, torn between wanting to confront whatever was out there and the primal instinct to stay hidden. After what felt like hours, the footsteps finally faded into the distance, leaving the cabin in a tense, oppressive silence. I got up, my hands shaking as I peered out the window, half expecting to see that shadowy figure lingering in the darkness. But there was nothing, just the endless stretch of snow and the dark line of trees. I returned to bed, my mind refusing to rest, knowing that the final night in the cabin would be anything but peaceful. In the morning light, the fear from the night before felt distant, but the memory of that loud, intentional bang at the door was still fresh. I decided to investigate, cautiously stepping outside to inspect the back door. My heart dropped when I saw it. The handle was damaged, scratched, and bent, as though someone had tried to force their way inside. The sight of the damaged handle erased any doubt I might have had about the strange occurrences. This wasn't my imagination or a trick of the mind. Someone had been here, right outside the cabin, attempting to break in. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, a deep, unsettling reminder of how isolated I was, how vulnerable. The cabin, once a haven of peace, had become a prison, and I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed up quickly, glancing nervously toward the forest as I loaded my belongings into the car. Each moment I spent near the cabin felt like a risk, as though whatever had been watching, lurking in the darkness, was still nearby, waiting. I forced myself to stay calm, moving with purpose until I was finally ready to leave. As I drove away from the cabin, the tension gradually ebbed, replaced by a sense of relief that washed over me as the distance grew between me and the eerie solitude of the mountain. The hospital loomed ahead, a hulking shadow against the gray sky, its windows shattered and dark. The paint on the exterior walls had long since peeled away, leaving patches of exposed brick that added to its eerie appearance. Something about the structure pulled me in, a morbid curiosity whispering that there were secrets waiting within those decayed walls. With a deep breath, I stepped through the broken front doors, feeling the temperature drop as I entered. The inside was worse than I'd imagined. Rows of empty beds, some with rusted frames, lined the walls, and the floors were strewn with discarded medical equipment that had likely seen its last use decades ago. Each step I took echoed in the silence, the only other sounds being the occasional drip of water and the distant creak of unstable floors above. Despite the silence, the atmosphere felt thick, almost stifling, as if the hospital itself resented my presence. I couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, I wasn't alone. But my curiosity kept me moving, drawn deeper into the winding corridors. Each turn revealed more remnants of the past, faded signs, broken wheelchairs, cabinets emptied of supplies. The desolation was palpable, and yet something urged me to press on, a pull I couldn't ignore. I had wandered further than I'd intended, losing track of time and distance in the maze of corridors. Just as I considered turning back, I noticed a peculiar door tucked away in a narrow hallway that seemed to lead nowhere. Unlike the other doors in the hospital, this one was intact, untouched by the decay that marked the rest of the building. No broken handle, no peeling paint, just a clean, closed door, standing out against its dilapidated surroundings. Curiosity surged within me, mingling with a growing sense of apprehension. I stepped closer, reaching out to grasp the handle, half expecting it to be locked. To my surprise, it turned smoothly, and the door creaked open, revealing a room that looked untouched by time. Inside, the walls were unblemished, the floor free of dust, as though someone had been there recently. This wasn't just a forgotten room, it looked lived in. I scanned the room, noticing a bed with rumpled sheets, a small table with scattered belongings, and a single dim light that cast an eerie glow across the space. It was as if I had stepped into someone else's world, hidden within the decayed remains of the hospital. I entered the room slowly, each step filling me with a mixture of dread and fascination. Scattered across the small table were personal items, a half-empty bottle of water, a worn notebook, and scraps of paper covered in hastily scribbled notes. I picked one up, reading the words scrawled in dark ink. "They are watching me. I can't leave. I'm trapped here." My pulse quickened as I sifted through the notes, each one more disturbing than the last. Some were warnings, cautioning to stay hidden and never make a sound. Others were cryptic, referencing things lurking in the dark, unseen presences that seemed to haunt whoever had written them. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was intruding on someone's private nightmare, yet I was unable to look away. Then I noticed a small pile of belongings in the corner. A coat, a few items of clothing, all arranged as if someone intended to return. The realization hit me with a cold finality. Someone had been living here, hiding in this forgotten room within the hospital. A deep unease settled over me as I began to back away, feeling that I had seen more than I was meant to. With every step away from that room, the dread in my chest grew. I knew I had to leave, to escape the hospital's grip before I stumbled upon something worse. The hallways seemed darker now, the silence heavier, pressing down on me like an invisible weight. As I retraced my steps, I felt the hospital's oppressive presence intensify, as if the very walls were aware of me, urging me to leave before it was too late. But as I neared what I thought was the exit, a shadow caught my eye. At the end of the corridor stood a figure, cloaked in darkness, wearing a hood that obscured any features. My heart froze, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure was motionless, standing as though waiting for me, a silent sentinel bearing my way. I took a step back, the urge to flee warring with the primal fear that held me frozen in place. Then, without warning, the figure moved, taking a slow, deliberate step toward me. Panic surged, and I turned, sprinting down the nearest hallway, my footsteps echoing as I ran, feeling the weight of the figure's gaze on my back. I didn't dare look behind me, focused solely on escaping the labyrinthine nightmare that the hospital had become. The pounding of my heart drowned out every other sound as I sprinted down the hallway, my eyes darting around for any sign of an exit. But no matter which way I turned, the hospital corridors all seemed identical. Endless stretches of decayed walls and broken doors that only added to the suffocating sense of disorientation. Each hallway bled into the next, with no signs or landmarks to guide me, as though the hospital itself were conspiring to trap me within its walls. I forced myself to stop, to catch my breath, hoping to get my bearings. But as soon as I slowed, I sensed the hooded figure behind me, relentless in its pursuit. I glanced back, and there it was, standing just a few paces away, its dark hood pulled low, obscuring its face. The sight of it filled me with a fear unlike anything I'd ever felt, a presence that was both human and something else entirely. The figure took another step toward me, its movements slow yet purposeful, almost as if it enjoyed my fear, feeding off my terror. With no other choice, I turned and ran again, my instincts screaming at me to escape, to get as far away from this thing as possible. I could hear its footsteps behind me, relentless and inescapable, echoing in the empty halls. My feet pounded against the floor as I tore through the hallways, my breath shallow and ragged. Every turn I took seemed to lead me deeper into the hospital, further from any exit, each corridor identical to the last, blending together in a nightmarish maze that had no end. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the hospital itself were closing in, urging me to run faster, to keep moving with no hope of escape. I could feel the figure's presence behind me, the soft, rhythmic sound of its footsteps matching my pace, a constant reminder that I wasn't alone. Desperation clawed at me, twisting my thoughts as I tried to remember the path back, but the hospital's layout had shifted in my mind, an unyielding puzzle with no solution. Turning a corner, I stumbled, nearly falling as I struggled to keep my balance. Panic surged as I glanced back, expecting to see the figure closer, but the hallway was empty. For a brief, hopeful moment, I thought I'd lost it, that maybe I had finally outrun the thing chasing me. But the silence was deceptive, a trick that offered no real reprieve. I knew it was still there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to falter. In the distance, a faint glimmer of light broke through the darkness, a door leading outside, the only indication of an exit I'd seen since entering the hospital. Fueled by a surge of adrenaline, I pushed myself forward, my legs burning as I sprinted toward the door, the possibility of escape within reach. The air around me felt electric, charged with the presence of something dark, something that wanted me to stay. Behind me, I heard the figure's footsteps quicken, an unnatural rhythm that matched my desperation. I didn't dare look back. Every instinct was focused on reaching the exit, on escaping the nightmare that had turned this hospital into a trap. The door loomed closer, its handle shining in the dim light as I extended my hand, praying that it would open, that it wasn't just another trick. With a final burst of energy, I lunged for the door, grabbing the handle and pushing it open. Cold air hit my face as I stumbled outside, the silence of the hospital replaced by the stillness of the night. But as I crossed the threshold, I felt a chill at my back, a lingering sensation that told me the figure was closer than ever. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I ran until the hospital was a distant shadow against the sky, my lungs burning as I finally slowed, realizing I had escaped. Standing outside, the hospital now a dark silhouette in the distance, I tried to steady my breathing, to shake the fear that clung to me like a second skin. The world felt different, quieter somehow, as though the hospital's influence still lingered even here, far from its walls. I glanced back, half expecting to see the hooded figure watching from the doorway, but there was only darkness, an endless, silent void. The click of the door echoed through the empty library, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet as I tugged at the handle, realizing with growing frustration that it was locked. I'd been browsing through the aisles, losing track of time as I leafed through dusty volumes and explored the hidden corners of the massive library. But now the reality of my situation settled in. I was trapped, locked inside, with no way out until morning. I walked to the main desk, hoping to find some sign of a key or a way to contact someone, but the place was eerily deserted. I checked my phone, but the signal was weak, and my attempts to reach anyone were met with static. The idea of spending the entire night alone in this dim, silent place wasn't exactly comforting, but I tried to rationalize it. It was just a library, I told myself. Nothing to fear. Taking a deep breath, I settled into a chair, preparing myself for the long hours ahead. The dim lighting cast elongated shadows between the shelves, giving the rows of books an almost menacing presence. I could feel the silence thickening, pressing in on me, broken only by the faint hum of the heating system. Little did I know that this silence would soon be shattered by something far more unsettling. I was flipping through an old book, trying to distract myself, when I heard it. A soft rustling, like pages being turned somewhere deep in the rows. I froze, straining to listen, but the sound stopped as quickly as it had started, leaving me questioning if I'd heard anything at all. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the building settling or a draft blowing through. but my nerves were already on edge. Minutes passed, and then the sounds started again. Soft footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from somewhere among the shelves. I glanced around, searching for a logical explanation, but the shadows seemed to stretch endlessly, swallowing the faint traces of movement. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, dark and unmoving, watching me from between the rows. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the shadows. My heart raced as I scanned the shelves, looking for any sign of the figure, but the space was empty. Rationalizing it as a trick of the light, I returned to my seat, trying to ignore the lingering feeling that I was not alone. The sense of being watched settled over me, growing stronger with each passing moment. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. I could feel the tension building, every creak of the old library heightened, every flicker of movement catching my eye. The shadows seemed to deepen, twisting and merging, and every corner now felt like it hid a presence just out of sight. I tried moving to another part of the library, hoping that shifting locations might help shake the eerie feeling. But as I did, I caught another glimpse of the figure, this time standing closer, partially obscured behind a shelf. A shiver ran through me as I moved behind another shelf, hoping to put distance between us, but every time I turned, I saw it again, always in the shadows, always watching. The figure's presence was unsettling, the silent observation deliberate and unyielding. Each time I tried to hide, to shift my position, the figure seemed to reappear, its dark silhouette a reminder that I wasn't alone. The library's silence now felt oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak or whisper of movement, each sound feeding the growing dread in my mind. I could no longer convince myself it was just my imagination. Something was there, watching, lurking within the dark aisles of books. Desperation began to override my fear. I couldn't spend the night evading this silent watcher, not knowing whether it was real or some figment of my imagination. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to move closer to where I'd last seen the figure, determined to confront whatever was haunting the library. I scanned each aisle carefully, stepping slowly, my senses heightened as I searched for any sign of movement. But each time I thought I'd cornered it, the figure slipped away, vanishing into the shadows as if it had never been there. I could feel frustration building, mingling with the dread, and I started questioning my own senses. The figure was toying with me, staying just far enough away to remain elusive, but close enough to make its presence unmistakable. No matter how many times I searched, how many aisles I checked, it evaded me, moving with an almost unnatural silence. With every failed attempt, my unease grew, the walls of the library feeling closer, more confining, as though I were being led into a trap. My breaths came quicker, and I felt my pulse race, each shadow seeming to shift and merge, creating illusions of movement. I was no longer simply locked inside the library. I was trapped, confined by something that seemed to have no intention of letting me go. As the hours dragged on, my fear escalated into raw panic. Every attempt I made to avoid the figure only brought me closer to its shadow, as if it were anticipating my every move, waiting in the spots I least expected. I moved from one section of the library to the next, ducking behind shelves, squeezing into tight aisles, desperately hoping to lose it. But the figure seemed to multiply, appearing from every angle, a dark, silent watcher that refused to let me out of its sight. The air felt thick, stifling, pressing down on me with each step I took. My footsteps, once steady, had turned frantic, echoing loudly in the silence. In my desperation, I almost called out, hoping that somehow, someone would answer, that there was a way out of this. But each whisper, every faint creak, only reminded me how alone I was. It was as if the library itself had conspired to trap me, every shadow concealing the figure as it drew closer, waiting for me to tire. My mind raced, scrambling for any way to escape. Yet with each passing minute, my options dwindled, and the sense of inevitability sank in, a terrifying realization that dawn wouldn't come quickly enough. As the hours crept toward dawn, a strange calm settled over the library. The footsteps and whispers faded, replaced by an uneasy stillness that was somehow worse than the constant pursuit. It was as though the figure had retreated, slipping back into the shadows, leaving me alone in a silence that felt unnatural, watchful. I forced myself to breathe, to steady my racing heart, as I tried to make sense of what I'd experienced. Had my mind conjured the figure, turning the shadows into something sinister? Or had I truly seen it, a presence lurking in the library, drawn to my fear? I wanted to believe it was all in my head, that the isolation and dim light had twisted my senses. But a final glance around the empty library betrayed a hint of movement in the farthest aisle, a reminder that whatever haunted this place had not truly gone. I sank into a chair, willing myself to stay calm, clinging to the knowledge that dawn was near. The calm didn't bring relief, only a heightened awareness that I'd survived the night, but barely, haunted by a figure I couldn't explain. As the first light of dawn seeped through the windows, casting a faint glow across the dusty shelves, I felt a surge of determination. After a night spent evading the figure, I couldn't leave without knowing if it had been real or a hallucination born of fear and fatigue. The faint light seemed to chase away the shadows, stripping the library of its menace, transforming it back into an ordinary building. I steeled myself and rose from the chair, moving cautiously through the aisles, searching each corner, half expecting the figure to materialize at any moment. My senses were on edge, every flicker of light and every shifting shadow heightening my awareness. I scanned the rows meticulously, hoping to find a trace of whatever had haunted me, a sign that would either confirm or deny the existence of the figure. But the library was empty, each aisle devoid of any presence. There was no shadowy figure lurking in the corners, no movement beyond my own. The building was silent, and yet the memory of the night hung heavily, a lingering sense of dread I couldn't shake. As I stepped out of the library into the cool morning air, a wave of relief washed over me. The night had left me shaken, yet somehow free from the weight of the figure's presence. I had never been a particularly nervous person. My house, tucked away at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, had always given me a sense of peace. The night sounds, the distant hum of crickets, an occasional breeze stirring the trees, were soothing, almost lulling me to sleep. But on that first night, something felt off. I was lying in bed, slipping towards sleep, when I heard it. A faint rustling sound, just outside my bedroom window. I ignored it at first, chalking it up to an animal, or perhaps the wind catching on something outside. But it didn't stop. The sound continued, sporadically, barely loud enough to catch my attention, but persistent enough to keep me awake. I lay there, listening. The seconds stretched into minutes, the quiet punctuated only by that soft, irregular noise. When I finally decided to glance out the window, all I saw was darkness, the pale glow of the moon casting weak shadows over the lawn. Nothing appeared out of place. I forced myself to ignore it, attributing the noise to paranoia. But as I tried to close my eyes again, sleep felt impossibly far away. It wasn't just the sound, I realized. It was the feeling that I was somehow not alone, that something outside my window was watching. The next night, I tried to shake off the lingering unease. I went about my evening as usual, trying to convince myself that the previous night had been a fluke. I even opened a book to distract myself. But as soon as the house quieted, I heard it again. Footsteps, soft and deliberate, padding along the grass outside. I froze, straining my ears. The footsteps grew closer, the sound muted but distinct, a quiet crunch of leaves and gravel underfoot. I told myself it was nothing, a wandering cat, or perhaps someone from the neighborhood taking an odd nighttime stroll. Still, my nerves buzzed as I lay still, unwilling to investigate but unable to ignore the sounds. The next morning, I did a cursory check around the house, circling the yard and inspecting the windows. Nothing seemed disturbed at first, until I noticed a small stone resting against the wall by my bedroom window. It hadn't been there the day before, of that I was certain. I kicked it aside, hoping that maybe I had simply overlooked it, but a chill lingered in the pit of my stomach. That night, I stayed up a little longer, convinced that I could hear every small noise in the yard, every gust of wind, every faint sound. Even though I couldn't see anyone or anything, the idea that someone was near began to take root, unsettling me in a way I couldn't shake. After those first 2 nights, I found myself glancing out my windows more often, especially before going to bed. Each morning, I would carefully inspect the area outside, looking for any indication that someone had been there. It didn't take long for me to notice subtle changes. Footprints in the grass, a scuff mark near the window, and even a piece of bent grass where someone might have stepped. The realization crept up on me, slow and insidious. Someone was out there, coming near my window, night after night. The thought was absurd, too surreal to believe. But each morning, a new detail would emerge, a tiny confirmation that I wasn't imagining things. It wasn't just paranoia, it was evidence. I tried to stay up one night, waiting and listening, my eyes glued to the faint glow beyond the curtains. Hours ticked by, and the silence became oppressive, pressing against my ears. I didn't hear anything that night, but I knew I wasn't safe. The footsteps and sounds, once vague, had become the markers of a presence I couldn't ignore. One morning, as I inspected the yard again, I noticed something strange. The small potted plant by my back step was gone. I scanned the area, wondering if I had moved it or if it had somehow fallen over, but there was no sign of it anywhere. A small trowel was also missing, something I kept by the back door for light gardening. I checked inside the house, then returned outside, thoroughly confused. In the days that followed, more items disappeared. First small things, then more significant pieces like a larger plant and a shovel. It was as though someone was taking inventory of my belongings, slowly testing the boundaries of my patience. The yard felt like a game board, each missing item an unsettling reminder that I was being watched. The feeling that someone was there became nearly unbearable. I started to check the locks multiple times each night, tugging at every window to ensure it was secure. I never saw anyone, and yet each morning I felt violated, aware that someone had been close enough to touch what was mine, close enough to shatter any sense of safety I had. The dread that had started as a whisper was now a steady drumbeat, reminding me that I was being watched, that whoever was out there had no intention of leaving. And still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. It was early morning when I noticed the damage. The back door had deep scratches, gouges that dug into the wood as if someone had tried to pry it open. I stood there, staring at the marks, feeling a cold wave of realization wash over me. This wasn't just someone lingering near my windows or taking small things from the yard. They were trying to get inside. I ran my fingers over the rough scratches, tracing the pattern. It wasn't the work of an animal. The marks were deliberate, intentional, and terrifyingly human. I backed away, my eyes scanning the yard, half expecting to see someone crouching in the shadows. There was no one in sight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The scratches on the door were the final confirmation I needed. My sense of security, the feeling of safety in my own home, was gone. That night, I barely slept, too aware of every noise, every creak in the house, every whisper of wind against the walls. The fear that had simmered beneath the surface now felt like an electric current, thrumming through my veins, keeping me alert and awake. I knew I couldn't live like this, jumping at shadows, waiting for something to happen. The damage to the door was more than just a physical sign. It was a declaration, a message from whoever was out there. They weren't just watching. They were coming closer, closing in. And I knew, deep down, that if I stayed, they would eventually find a way inside. The decision to move was made, but there was one more night to endure before I could leave. I went through my usual routine, checking each lock, each window, pulling the curtains tight. The silence in the house was thick, almost suffocating, pressing against my eardrums as I lay in bed, staring up at the dark ceiling. Every sound felt amplified. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock in the hall, the creak of the floorboards as I shifted my weight. And then, from somewhere near the back door, I heard it. A soft, dragging sound, like someone brushing against the outside wall. My body tensed, every muscle locking into place as I held my breath, listening. The noise stopped, only to be followed by a gentle but deliberate creak, the kind that happens when weight is pressed against wood. It was unmistakable. Someone was there, standing on the other side of the door, pressing against it. I could feel my heartbeat hammering in my chest, loud enough to drown out the silence, to mask whatever was happening outside. I didn't dare move. I lay there, every nerve screaming, waiting for the next sound, the next indication that whoever was out there might try to get inside. But nothing happened. After a few agonizing minutes, the silence returned, thick and heavy, as though it was mocking me, daring me to move to see what might be waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed paralyzed, knowing that I was too close to something I didn't understand, something that wanted to get closer still. Morning arrived, and with it, a sense of urgency I couldn't ignore. I began packing immediately, throwing my belongings into boxes without any real organization. Each item I put away felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders, a small step toward escape. But even as I moved through the house, I felt that same gnawing sensation in the back of my mind, the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the task at hand. I was nearly done when I caught a glimpse of something through the kitchen window. Movement. Just a slight shift in the shadows near the edge of the yard. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the box, heart pounding as I stared out at the spot where I'd seen it. Nothing moved, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming, a pressure that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I tore myself away from the window, throwing the last of my belongings into a bag and rushing to lock the door behind me. I didn't look back as I walked to the car, not wanting to see if there was someone, something watching from the shadows. I could still feel it, though. That unshakable sense of eyes on me, following my every step as I finally, mercifully left that house behind. When my neighbor Craig moved in next door, I thought little of it. He was friendly enough, middle-aged, a bit reserved, but polite, with the occasional chat over the fence or wave when we crossed paths. I enjoyed the exchange of small pleasantries, finding comfort in the ordinary interactions that accompany living in a quiet neighborhood. One evening, we found ourselves talking outside as I returned from work, discussing books. My job in publishing always lent itself to conversations about literature, so when Craig noticed I was holding a novel, he seemed genuinely interested. We talked briefly about favorite authors, the kind of books that get under your skin. I found it refreshing to have a neighbor who shared my enthusiasm for reading. When I mentioned a book I'd recently finished, a rare, haunting work by an obscure writer, his eyes lit up, and I didn't hesitate to offer it to him. Lending books to friends was something I'd always done. I enjoyed sharing stories, and it was a simple way to connect. Craig accepted it with a grateful smile, promising to return it soon. As I handed it over, a small thrill of friendship sparked, something I'd been missing in my otherwise solitary life. A few days later, Craig knocked on my door, holding the book with an odd expression. He looked almost tense, the way one might after having read something particularly affecting or unsettling. He handed it over with a slight nod, his eyes lingering on mine for a moment longer than I was comfortable with. The moment felt strangely loaded, the easy camaraderie we'd shared now tinted with something unspoken. That evening, I went about my usual routine, feeling oddly compelled to flip through the book again before returning it to my shelf. As I turned the pages, I froze. Scrawled in the margins, in hurried, uneven handwriting, were notes, cryptic sentences, strange symbols, and phrases that seemed completely disconnected from the story. The writing looked manic, like someone had been frantically scribbling as thoughts poured out, urgent and disjointed. "They're watching," read one note. "This is only the beginning," warned another. Each sentence felt like a coded message, layered with meanings that seemed to elude me. The symbols, swirling and geometric, only added to the disturbing quality, as if they held a hidden significance just out of reach. I sat there, holding the book in my lap, feeling a creeping chill. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the way they felt oddly directed, like a private revelation I wasn't meant to see. The Craig I'd spoken with was quiet and polite. This writing felt intense, almost feverish. I set the book down, closing it slowly, but the sense of unease clung to me, filling my thoughts as the evening wore on. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to look at the notes again, to make sense of the phrases that felt like they were clawing at the edges of my mind. I sat down with the book, flipping through the pages slowly, my eyes scanning each note, each symbol, each frantic line. The notes were scattered throughout, seemingly random at first glance. Some of the phrases seemed nonsensical, yet the repetition was striking. "Can't escape. It sees you." These statements appeared more than once, each time growing more emphatic, more desperate, as if they were warnings. On one page, Craig had sketched something, a series of triangles connected by jagged lines, surrounded by small, chaotic markings. I found myself staring at it, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread. It was as though the shapes themselves held some dark secret, something that Craig had wanted to convey through the pages of my book. I tried to dismiss it, to chalk it up to an overactive imagination. But the words, the way they flowed with a certain intensity, left an impression that lingered. Why would Craig write these things in a borrowed book? Was he trying to communicate something, or was there something wrong with him? The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. It was as if a shadow had crept into my mind, and I was beginning to see Craig through a different, darker lens. Over the next few days, I started noticing changes in Craig's behavior. It wasn't anything overt, just a shift, subtle at first, but unsettling in its own way. He no longer seemed like the friendly, quiet neighbor I'd chatted with over the fence. Instead, he seemed withdrawn, almost evasive, yet his gaze followed me with an intensity I couldn't ignore. One afternoon, as I was leaving for work, I saw him standing by his window, watching my house. He didn't wave, didn't acknowledge me. He just stood there, staring, his face obscured by shadow, but his posture was rigid, almost menacing. I told myself it was nothing, just a coincidence, but the image of him standing there lingered, gnawing at my thoughts throughout the day. Later, when I ran into him outside, his expression was strained, almost as if he were holding back some knowledge he couldn't or wouldn't share. He made vague comments, talking about seeing things in a new light and understanding what's really there. His words felt loaded, each one pushing me closer to an edge I hadn't even realized I was standing on. The conversations became shorter, but each one left a residue of unease, a feeling that I couldn't quite shake. His words, his cryptic glances, the notes in the book, all of it coalesced into a slow, creeping dread. I started avoiding him, keeping my distance, but his presence seemed to press in on me, a constant, silent reminder of the things I'd seen, the strange writings he'd left behind. I had hoped that avoiding Craig would make things go back to normal, but he started showing up at my door unexpectedly, usually in the late evening when the neighborhood was quiet and dark. He'd knock, sometimes softly, other times with an urgent rhythmic tap that set my nerves on edge. When I opened the door, his face was always the same, intense, his eyes fixed on mine as if he were searching for something I couldn't understand. He would stand there, just beyond the threshold, and ask if I'd read the notes. His voice was low, almost conspiratorial, as if we were sharing some dark secret. "Have you seen it yet?" he'd ask, his gaze drilling into me. "Do you understand the messages?" I tried to brush him off, hoping he'd lose interest. I would tell him I was busy, that I needed to go. But he lingered, his presence filling the doorway with an uncomfortable weight. The tension built each time he appeared, his questions becoming more probing, his demeanor increasingly unhinged. It was as though he'd become consumed by whatever had driven him to scrawl those cryptic notes in my book, and he wanted me to join him in whatever twisted reality he'd discovered. Each time I closed the door, I felt a surge of relief, but it never lasted. His presence had become a dark shadow in my life, an intruder I couldn't escape, no matter how tightly I shut the door. One night, Craig's knocking was different, louder, more insistent. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me not to answer, but something compelled me to face him one last time. When I opened the door, he was standing there, eyes wide, his face twisted with an intensity that was almost feral. "You need to finish it," he said, his voice a low, desperate rasp. "You need to finish what I started." He leaned in close, his face inches from mine, and I could see the dark circles under his eyes, the wild look that hinted at sleepless nights, at something gnawing away at him from the inside. I backed away, my hands gripping the edge of the door, heart pounding as I took in his words. There was a look of desperation in his eyes, as though he were clinging to something, and he was determined to drag me into it with him. "No," I said, my voice steady but firm. "I don't want any part of this." His expression shifted, the intensity draining from his face, leaving only a hollow, almost resigned look. For a moment, he seemed like the neighbor I had once spoken to over the fence, the friendly man who had borrowed a book. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of his house. I shut the door, feeling a finality settle over me, as though I had closed a door on something far darker than I understood. The next morning, when I looked out the window, I saw a moving truck parked in front of Craig's house. It was surreal, almost as though the events of the past few weeks had been nothing more than a strange dream. Craig was moving out, leaving without a word, without any explanation. I watched as he loaded boxes into the truck, his movements slow, methodical. There was no rush, no urgency, just a strange sense of detachment. He didn't glance toward my house, didn't acknowledge me. It was as if I no longer existed in his world, as if whatever had consumed him was complete. By evening, the house was empty, a hollow shell of what it had once been. I felt a mixture of relief and unease, a strange, unsettling calm that left me questioning everything. Craig had left as abruptly as he had arrived, taking with him the strange energy that had filled my days with dread. But his departure wasn't a clean break. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind, a lingering presence that clung to the walls, to the spaces where he had once stood. And as I looked at the empty house next door, a sense of finality settled over me, accompanied by a gnawing question I couldn't answer. The house had seemed like a miracle, one of those rare finds that almost felt too good to be true. It was nestled in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where people still kept flower boxes by their windows and greeted each other in passing, and the price, unbelievably low. I told myself it was just luck, that sometimes good things happened unexpectedly. Within a few days of seeing the listing, I signed the lease, packed my things, and moved in. As I unpacked, that first day felt a bit surreal, like I was stepping into someone else's life. Despite being unfurnished, the house hadn't been entirely cleared out. A few things had been left behind: an old, worn chair in the living room, a mug on the kitchen counter, a small stack of boxes in a closet. I assumed the previous tenant must have overlooked them, but it gave the place a strange, unsettled energy, as though the house hadn't been properly emptied. The thought crossed my mind that maybe this house wasn't as perfect as it seemed, but I brushed it off, chalking it up to the chaos of moving. I spent the evening unpacking, trying to settle in, though an odd feeling lingered, a sense that the house was still holding on to the life it had before I arrived. Over the next few days, I found myself noticing more and more unusual details. There were small holes in the walls that had been hastily patched, as if someone had needed to cover something up quickly. The patchwork wasn't smooth. Rough edges of plaster bulged in places, evidence of a hurried job. I ran my fingers over the spots, feeling the uneven surface beneath my skin, an odd sensation creeping up my spine. In the closet, there were even more signs of the previous tenant's sudden departure. I found clothes stuffed into the corners, a half-empty box of cereal on a shelf, and a few scattered photographs with faces blurred or missing, as if they'd been hastily torn from frames. There was a certain disarray to it all, a feeling that something had interrupted the previous tenant, forcing them to leave abruptly. It was as if they'd been mid-move, scrambling to grab what they could, and then vanished, leaving the rest behind. Each discovery heightened my discomfort. I wondered why anyone would leave in such a rush. What could have driven them to abandon so many of their belongings? The house began to feel less like a home and more like a place with secrets, a place that didn't want me there. One afternoon, while scrubbing down the walls in the hallway, I noticed faint scratches beneath the paint. They were barely visible, concealed under a thin coat of off-white paint that had cracked in places, revealing the marks beneath. Curiosity got the better of me, and I scraped gently, uncovering more of the surface. Hidden under layers of paint were words, scratched deep into the wall. My breath hitched as I read the first one. "Don't look." I moved farther down the wall, revealing more cryptic messages. "It sees you," and "Get out." The phrases were unsettling, each one a fragment of warning or fear. Whoever had left these messages had been desperate, that much was clear. The words were scratched roughly, like someone had used whatever they could to leave these warnings. I tried to ignore the creeping dread, but it gnawed at me, each message adding weight to the question that had been forming in my mind since I moved in. What had happened to the person who lived here before me? As I stepped back, looking at the scratched phrases, I felt a sudden urge to leave, to walk out and not return. But I dismissed it, convincing myself that it was nothing more than leftover nerves from the move. Still, the messages stayed with me, their meaning hanging over the house like a dark cloud. The house grew quieter each night, the silence so thick that even the smallest sound seemed amplified. At first, it was just the usual noises of a new house settling, or so I told myself. But the more I tried to ignore them, the louder they seemed to become. A soft creak here, a faint tap there, always just enough to draw my attention, but never enough to prove anything was truly wrong. One night, as I lay in bed, I thought I heard footsteps, soft, measured, as though someone were moving through the hallway outside my room. I held my breath, my body tensing, but when I strained to listen, all I heard was silence, just the empty quiet of the house around me. But the tension lingered, refusing to release its grip. Over the following nights, the feeling grew. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edge of my vision, faint movements that vanished when I turned to look. I told myself it was nothing, just the natural adjustment to a new space, a trick of the mind. But deep down, I felt the weight of something else, an unseen presence that lingered in the shadows, watching, waiting. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the strangeness of the house get to me. But the feeling was undeniable, growing stronger with each passing night, an unshakable sense that I wasn't alone. And no matter how many lights I left on, how much I told myself it was just nerves, the unease remained, pressing in on me like a thick fog, filling the house with an air of silent, lingering dread. It was a little after midnight when I woke up with a sudden urge to go to the bathroom. The house was eerily silent, the kind of silence that felt heavy, almost oppressive, pressing down on everything. I got out of bed, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake the lingering drowsiness. I told myself to relax, that it was just another quiet night in a new house. As I stepped into the hallway, a faint movement caught my eye. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest, and froze. At the end of the hall, near the front door, stood a shadowy figure. Its outline was indistinct, blurred, as though it were more shadow than substance. The figure was tall, with a posture that felt unnatural, its head slightly tilted as if studying me. We locked eyes, or at least I thought we did. Though I couldn't make out its face, I felt its gaze boring into me, sharp and intense, pinning me in place. My mind scrambled to make sense of what I was seeing, but no rational explanation came. It was just there, silently watching, like it had been waiting for me. A chill spread through me, rooting me to the spot. I didn't dare move, didn't dare look away, afraid that if I blinked, it would draw closer. My heart pounded, every instinct screaming at me to flee. But I couldn't tear my gaze away, trapped by the figure's silent presence. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, locked in that tense, silent standoff. Then, without warning, the figure bolted. It moved with a speed that seemed unnatural, darting toward the front door in a fluid, almost inhuman motion. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the house, jolting me out of my frozen state. I staggered back, my heart racing as I tried to process what had just happened. My mind buzzed with questions. Had it been a person? A trick of the light? Something else entirely? But the memory of its shape, the way it had stood there, watching, was seared into my mind. I stumbled to the door, my hands shaking as I checked the lock. It was still secure, bolted tightly from the inside. Yet somehow, that figure had been there, within the walls of my home, standing in my hallway, watching me. I backed away, unable to shake the feeling that it was still close by, lurking just beyond the threshold. The house felt different now, as though the walls had closed in, leaving me no space to breathe. The rational part of me wanted to dismiss it as a nightmare, a waking hallucination, anything but what it had seemed. But the dread in my chest told me otherwise. Something had been in my house, and it had looked at me with a hunger that sent a chill straight to my bones. The morning light brought no comfort. I moved through the house, gathering my belongings as quickly as possible, my mind a blur of fear and urgency. I couldn't stay another night here, not after what I'd seen. The thought of facing another encounter with that figure, of feeling its gaze on me again, was more than I could bear. As I packed, I noticed more strange details I'd previously overlooked. Small markings etched into the wood of the doorframe, scratches along the floorboards, faint, almost imperceptible symbols. They were everywhere, subtle but pervasive, as if someone had left a trail, a warning of sorts, etched into every corner of the house. The messages I'd seen scratched into the walls now felt like they made sense. A series of signs pointing to something dark, something I had been too blind to see. I realized, with a sinking feeling, that I'd walked into a place marked by someone else's desperation, someone who had tried to leave a warning, but had been forced out before they could finish. By the time I was done packing, I felt raw, drained, like I had spent years in that house instead of days. I closed the last box, glancing around the room one final time. It was just an empty space now, devoid of life, but something dark still lingered in the air, like a shadow clinging to the walls. With each step away from the house, I felt a sense of relief, a loosening of the fear that had gripped me for days. I threw my things into the car, not caring how they landed, just desperate to put distance between myself and the place that had filled my nights with dread. The old theater had been a fixture in the town for decades, its crumbling facade a reminder of its former grandeur. Set to be demolished within the month, it had drawn the attention of me and a small group of friends, each of us eager for one last adventure before it disappeared forever. The thought of exploring it, seeing what secrets lay within, had an irresistible pull, especially with rumors about its haunted history. As we stepped inside, the air was thick with dust, and the silence felt almost reverent, broken only by the faint creaks of the floorboards beneath our feet. The theater was vast, its rows of decaying seats stretching out into the darkness, the stage looming like a relic of some forgotten performance. At first, we wandered through the aisles, taking in the eerie quiet, but soon a strange sound caught our attention. A faint noise, almost like a whisper, seemed to echo from somewhere below the stage. We paused, listening as the sound faded in and out, almost as if beckoning us closer. Curiosity gripped us, and with little more than a glance at each other, we moved toward the stage, drawn by the soft, unsettling noise that filled the emptiness around us. Standing at the edge of the stage, the faint sound grew clearer, an intermittent rustling, low and persistent. We exchanged uneasy glances, each of us feeling a mix of excitement and trepidation. As we carefully searched around the stage, moving through the shadows, one of my friends noticed a slight gap in the floorboards near the center. There, hidden in plain sight, was a trapdoor, the wood weathered and nearly blending into the floor. It took some effort, but with a collective heave, we managed to pry it open. The trapdoor creaked, revealing a dark staircase leading down into the unknown. The air wafting up from below was stale and heavy, carrying a faint, half-musty odor that made us hesitate. One by one, we looked at each other, waiting for someone to suggest we turn back, but no one spoke. Instead, we moved forward, each of us feeling an unspoken pull to descend, to uncover the mystery beneath the stage. With flashlights in hand, we began our descent, the stairs groaning underfoot, the darkness below swallowing us inch by inch. The stairs seemed to go on forever, each step echoing into the stillness. As we reached the bottom, our flashlights revealed a narrow, low-ceilinged space that seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. The walls were lined with strange markings, symbols etched into the stone, their meanings obscured by time and darkness. I felt a chill as I took in the symbols, each one jagged and erratic, almost as if carved in a frenzy. They looped and spiraled, interlocking in patterns that made little sense. Someone had clearly been down here, leaving their mark in a way that felt deeply unsettling. The longer we looked, the more it felt as if the walls were closing in, the symbols pressing in around us. One of my friends whispered that maybe we should turn back, but something about the space held us there, compelling us to explore further. It was as if the basement held its breath, waiting, watching as we inched forward, each of us drawn deeper into its quiet, claustrophobic embrace. As we moved farther into the basement, the signs of past rituals grew clearer. Melted candle stubs lay scattered on the floor, their wax hardened and cracked. Bones, small and brittle, lay in neat piles beside makeshift altars, adorned with faded cloth and trinkets that glinted in the flashlight beams. The air was thick with the stale scent of smoke and something older, something that lingered beneath the surface, sour and metallic. We stepped carefully, feeling like intruders in a place that had been left undisturbed for years, maybe even decades. The walls bore even more symbols, some smeared with a dark, unidentifiable substance that seemed to have seeped into the stone itself. Our flashlights illuminated strange artifacts strewn across the floor, broken mirrors, worn photographs, and scattered pages with handwriting that twisted across the paper in looping, erratic lines. An uncomfortable silence fell over us as we took it all in. Each artifact, each scrap of evidence, hinted at something sinister, a dark history concealed within the theater's walls. The weight of the room pressed down on us, a silent warning that we weren't meant to be here. But despite the fear simmering beneath the surface, something kept us there. Our curiosity overpowering the rational urge to leave. Our exploration led us to a far corner of the basement, where the remnants of the rituals seemed even more disturbing. I shined my flashlight on a pile of old photographs, their edges yellowed with age. Each image was faded, the faces barely discernible, but there was something haunting about them. They depicted people gathered in cloaks, their faces obscured, standing in a circle with hands raised in what looked like silent, solemn reverence. Another friend picked up a photograph, her hand shaking slightly as she examined it. In the dim light, we could just make out what looked like an altar, similar to the one we'd seen scattered with bones and artifacts. The people in the photo seemed to be conducting some sort of ritual, their faces concealed, each person's stance rigid, almost entranced. As we moved the flashlight beam across the walls, strange markings became visible. Words and symbols that none of us recognized, scrawled in a haphazard manner, their meaning lost to time. I felt a creeping sensation that these symbols were trying to tell us something, a message buried in the cryptic ancient language. Our nervous chatter died down, replaced by a heavy silence as we absorbed the implications of what we were seeing. We were deep in the theater now, surrounded by remnants of something dark, something we couldn't fully understand. The thrill of exploration had faded, replaced by an unease that grew with each new discovery. As we turned a corner, I thought I heard a faint sound, a whisper, barely audible, but distinct enough to cut through the silence. I froze, my heart pounding as I strained to listen. There it was again, a soft, almost rhythmic whisper that seemed to come from deeper within the basement. The others heard it too, their faces reflecting the same fear I felt. The whispers grew louder, echoing around us, and for a moment I felt a surge of panic, as though something was approaching. The symbols, the artifacts, the photographs, all of it suddenly felt less like remnants and more like a warning, a reminder of something that had been disturbed. Someone whispered that we should leave, the urgency clear in their voice. The air was thick, suffocating, as though it carried an invisible weight pressing down on us. It dawned on us all at once that we weren't alone, that something or someone might still be here. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows lengthening, moving in a way that felt almost alive. We didn't need any more convincing. As we backed away, the whispers grew faint, but the sensation of being watched, of something lingering just out of sight, grew stronger with every step. Our footsteps echoed as we stumbled back toward the stairs, our nerves fraying with every step. The theater, once silent, now seemed alive with faint creaks and distant, unplaceable sounds that filled the empty space around us. It was as if the building itself were aware of us, watching, waiting as we moved through it. Reaching the base of the stairs, we glanced back one last time. The basement stretched into darkness, the shadows dense and impenetrable. Just as we were about to ascend, one of us gasped, pointing toward the far corner of the basement. A dark figure stood there, barely visible in the dim light, its form just a silhouette against the gloom. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its gaze on us, cold and unyielding. We scrambled up the stairs, each of us racing toward the trapdoor, desperate to escape the darkness that seemed to be closing in. The air grew thick as we reached the top, the whispers now almost a hum, surrounding us as we threw the trapdoor shut. On the main floor, the theater was eerily silent again, but the atmosphere felt heavier, as though we had brought something with us. We rushed toward the exit, not daring to look back, our only thought to get as far away from that basement as possible. Outside, the cool night air hit us, a relief from the oppressive atmosphere of the theater. We stood there in silence, each of us shaken, our minds racing with what we'd just experienced. None of us wanted to talk about it, as though putting it into words would somehow make it more real, more lasting. We agreed, in hushed tones, to never speak of it again. There was an unspoken understanding that we had uncovered something that was never meant to be found, something dark and lingering that had now etched itself into our memories.